Bryce Lathrop didn't even look at me when he said it. We were barely 10 minutes into the department briefing, the same weekly gathering I'd led for over a decade, when he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp blazer, cleared his throat, and announced with what he probably thought was gravitas. As we enter a new phase, some legacy systems and legacy roles are no longer aligned with our vision. His gaze skimmed the room like a drone on autopilot. When it reached me, it barely paused. Calantha, we appreciate your years of service, but it's time to transition. Today will be your last day. There was no conversation, no thank you, just the sterile language of clean cuts and a fresh starts. Someone coughed. Another shuffled papers too loudly. Even the walls seemed to retreat from the moment. I didn't say a word. I simply folded my notepad shut, smoothed my skirt, and stood. My badge made a small final chirp against the sensor as I passed reception, one last indignity on the way out. Margaret at the front desk offered me a tight-lipped nod, the kind reserved for divorce court and sudden funerals. The elevator was slow, that old apex delay. I waited in silence, the hum of the fluorescents overhead louder than anything anyone could say. I stepped into the parking lot with a tote slung over my shoulder and the wind catching the hem of my coat. The afternoon had that early winter haze when sunlight feels apologetic and the air carries the sting of endings. Inside my bag, my thermos, a half-used graph pad, and a single frame wrapped carefully in a worn dish towel. I'd kept it on my office wall for years, an original draft ink on mylar edges, curling from time and pride. It was Helix V1.1. They called it something else now, of course. They'd rebranded it last quarter with a fresh logo and a $3 million marketing campaign. Sleek, efficient, scalable. That was the language Bryce loved. But beneath the rebranding and buzzwords, it was my system, my structure, my code, right down to the last recursive tree. They thought they were erasing a relic. They didn't know they were firing the architect. I tightened my grip on the tote as I slid into the driver's seat. The blueprint shifted on the passenger side, catching the light like a mirror. I sat still for a while, the car engine off the faint tick of cooling metal sounding louder than it should. On the passenger seat, the blueprint lay like a relic from another life. I unfolded the creased vellum carefully, letting the corners spread across my lap. Helix V1.1 inked by hand on a sleepless night 5 years ago with measurements I still remembered better than birthdays. Back then, the prototype was dismissed. Too complex, they said. Too expensive to integrate. Bryce wasn't even part of the company then. Apex had been struggling rationing printer paper and canceling holiday parties. I'd offered Helix to Jonah Bauer, the last CEO who still wore steel-toe boots to walkthroughs. He appreciated it, but he also said no. So I filed the patents myself, quietly, precisely, and under a separate entity I created for just this purpose, Morse Integrated Technologies. A shell company in name only, but the patents were real and airtight. The screen on my phone lit up. Bryce's smug face filled the live stream window as he stood on a stage, flanked by rented lights and corporate optimism. Today, he beamed, "We unveil Apex's leap into the future, a fully proprietary automation platform, a game changer for manufacturing efficiency." Behind him, the slideshow flicked forward, and there it was, Helix, or at least the version they were now calling Nexar Dynamics. New font. Blue and green gradient instead of monochrome gray, but the system flowchart was exactly the one I'd etched into my wallboard during a winter storm years ago. Identical syntax, same node structure, same command logic. I took a slow sip from my thermos. Green tea with lemon. The kind that didn't forgive mistakes. He clicked to another slide. Built in-house. Designed by the brightest minds in automation. He didn't know? None of them did. Not yet. I closed the blueprint and returned it to the bag, letting my fingers trail across the edges as I zipped it shut. Then I pressed play again, not on the live stream, but on the diagnostic dashboard I still had bookmarked from my home terminal. Apex never revoked my admin mirror. Helix was never designed to be obedient. It was designed to be right. Years ago, I realized the real threat to precision wasn't mechanical failure. It was human arrogance. So I built Helix with an immune system, a digital spine. Not to be aggressive, but to defend itself when someone tried to override what it knew was correct. If a foreign command touched critical threads without proper clearance, Helix wouldn't argue. It would isolate the infection and close the gate. Bryce's team triggered the first fail-safe 36 hours after launch. I saw it from my diagnostic mirror just as I was pruning the lavender. Sensor arrays on line 4 began misreading part sizes. Not a software bug, the command tree was rewritten mid-process, which Helix interpreted as hostile input. The auto-palletizer responded by defaulting to shutdown. When someone tried to manually restart it, the logic sequence fragmented. Conveyor speed dropped to 0. Then the joints locked entirely. One robotic arm jammed mid-rotation and flung a box of steel brackets halfway across the warehouse floor. No one was hurt, but they lost 2 pallets of inventory, fractured a lift frame, and had to bring in night shift early for cleanup. Estimated damage $180,000. Bryce chalked it up to poor implementation. The code base wasn't stable, he said on a call I wasn't supposed to hear. Somebody missed a patch. What he didn't realize was that Helix hadn't glitched. It had resisted. Every patch they added was viewed as intrusion. Every attempt to bypass security escalated the system's response. I'd built it like a coral reef, intricate, adaptive, quietly merciless. You don't notice it growing until it cuts you. By the time their consultants arrived with polished laptops and glossy jargon, Helix had already rotated its substructure. The core logic didn't exist where they thought it did anymore. It had migrated, cloaked itself. They weren't debugging a system, they were chasing a ghost through a maze that rearranged itself every 6 hours. And still, Bryce smiled for the cameras. He had no idea he'd declared war on something smarter than him. Helix wasn't born in a boardroom. It didn't come from a venture pitch or an innovation lab with standing desks and kombucha on tap. It came from my garage concrete floor, pegboard walls, solder smoke, hanging like incense. A space where no one interrupted me, where no one told me what couldn't be done. 5 years of weekends. Weeknights too, when the factory lights dimmed and the only thing louder than the humming servers was my cat knocking bolts off the workbench. While Bryce was probably streaming productivity TED Talks, I was laying out recursive nodes on butcher paper and mapping logic gates in permanent marker. There were no grants, no interns, just me, a surplus 3D printer, and whatever parts I could convince Apex's procurement system to lose in shipping. I pitched the prototype once. Jonah Bauer was still CEO then. He met me in the old breakroom sleeves, rolled up calluses on his hands, from fixing the line himself the day before. "This is brilliant," he said, flipping through the schematic. "But I've got 3 years left and no energy for revolutions." I nodded, thanked him, and left the packet on his desk. Then I drove home and started filing the first of 7 patents, each one under my holding company, Morse Integrated Technologies, each one sealed, time-stamped, and legally bulletproof. I wasn't naive. I knew how Apex worked. I knew what happened to engineers who didn't play politics, especially the ones with gray in their hair. That's why I embedded subroutines into the Helix core security loops keyed to my biometric data. No one else could modify the architecture without triggering cascade errors. No one even knew what I'd embedded. While Apex was busy rearranging cubicles and rebranding mission statements, I turned that garage into a fortress. Rack-mounted drives, redundant backups, more processing power than their entire R&D wing. Every wire labeled, every test logged, every detail archived in triplicate. They thought I was designing a tool. I was building a defense system. And now, with Bryce pressing deeper into a maze, he didn't understand I was already 2 moves ahead and preparing the 3rd. They came in suits that had never seen oil in laptops, that had never been opened without a latte nearby. Bryce flew them in from Austin, New York, Palo Alto names with 5-syllable firms and price tags that made accountants sweat. Their job was simple. Find out why the system wasn't responding. They called it a legacy integration problem, said the code base hadn't been updated properly, recommended a full rewrite within 90 days. One even suggested migrating to a blockchain-compatible framework, as if buzzwords could fix what they couldn't read. They didn't know Helix rewrote itself. That was the first thing I programmed into its DNA modular recursion. Every time it sensed a foreign override, it didn't just block the attempt, it evolved, shifted its logic tree, reshaped its syntax, relabeled its directories, like watching coral rearrange itself mid-tide. I watched from my garage tea steeping beside the terminal as the override commands failed in real time. One consultant tried brute force inputting line after line through a custom script. Helix absorbed the intrusion, routed it through a dummy process, and looped it back to his own terminal. He spent 2 hours debugging a decoy. Another tried to locate the core structure by tracing system calls. But Helix, being Helix, had already restructured its process map. By the time they found a thread to pull, it was already gone. They weren't navigating a system, they were wandering a shifting maze with invisible walls. One guy whispered, barely audible over the hum of the server room, "It's like it knows we're not supposed to be here." Bryce refused to listen. He kept demanding faster results, louder explanations. Said it wasn't sabotage, it was sloppiness. Said someone must have skipped onboarding protocols. What he didn't say, what he couldn't admit, was that he didn't understand the thing he claimed to have championed. Helix wasn't rejecting them out of spite. It was doing what it was designed to do, protect itself from misuse. And all they were doing was making it stronger. It started with a comment in the break room. Things never crashed like this. When Calantha was here, someone muttered barely loud enough to register. But that was all it took. My name began floating through the halls like a rumor with a memory. No one said it directly to Bryce, not yet. But in whispered corners over stale coffee and muted monitors, the engineers began remembering. Rowan was the first to reach out. A message pinged my private inbox just before noon. "You were Helix, weren't you?" No greeting, no signature, just that one line. I stared at it for a moment, then replied with a screenshot. U.S. Patent number 10.812.944B2 filed under Morse Integrated Technologies. 7 pages. My name embedded in every claim. He didn't respond, but the message was marked read within seconds. I imagined him blinking at his screen, slowly connecting all the dots they had spent thousands trying to trace. He had seen me build systems that outlived their funding cycles. He knew I never left a single process undocumented unless I meant to. Back at Apex, Bryce had entered a new stage of panic. Someone told me he screamed at the whiteboard during a systems briefing, then flung the dry erase marker across the room when no one had a solution. The IT team had been working double shifts, trying to reverse engineer Helix, but all they had to show were looping errors and recursive log files that regenerated every time they were deleted. Operators had started calling the system the virus. Half joking at first, then not at all. One even claimed the dashboard changed icons when no one was touching it, like it was watching them adapting. But I wasn't watching. Not exactly. I had given Helix its parameters and its conscience. It was doing what it was built to do. It didn't need me to interfere yet. I logged out of the mirror dashboard and reached for the folder marked Licensing and Enforcement. And it was time to make sure they understood who had built the system and who could stop it. I didn't send an email. That would have been too easy, too polite. Instead, I made a call to Rosenbell and Knox, a firm that specializes in intellectual property law, and more importantly, humiliation by paper. I gave them everything: the patents, the timestamps, the architecture logs, the mirrored system trails. They didn't blink. They just asked, "Do you want to go nuclear?" I told them to make it quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. 2 days later, a courier in a tailored gray suit walked through the glass doors of Apex headquarters. He carried no briefcase, just one thick envelope sealed with a wax stamp and heavy enough to make an impression in every sense of the word. He didn't sit, didn't ask for water. He handed the envelope to reception, signed the delivery log with a flourish, and said only 5 words. "Please confirm delivery. Thank you." Inside, an 8-page cease and desist letter. Letterhead so clean it hummed. 7 counts of patent infringement, every count backed by federal registration and deposition-ready exhibits. Page 6 outlined the required response: immediate cessation of Helix operations, disconnection of all dependent modules, and a sworn affidavit of compliance. But that wasn't all. To legally continue using the Helix system, Apex would need to pay a one-time licensing fee of $31.5 million, 10 times what Bryce had bragged about investing. And perhaps more painful, they'd need to issue a public apology, one printed in Manufacturing Today Tech Ops Weekly and Apex's own quarterly investor brief. The statement would acknowledge me, Calantha Morse, as the sole architect of Helix and denounce the dismissive, ageist, and unprofessional behavior that led to my removal. They had 5 business days. I imagine Bryce unfolding that letter at the long conference table in the war room, his smirk fading with each paragraph. He'd thought he was the future, thought he could steal the foundation without asking who poured the concrete. But now he'd reached the end of the blueprint, and every exit was locked. Bryce did exactly what I expected him to do. He refused. Maybe he thought ignoring the letter would buy him time. Maybe he believed his lawyers could bluff their way through a patent minefield, or maybe deep down he still believed Helix belonged to him just because he paid for a marketing rollout and renamed it. Whatever the reason, he marched into the server room the next morning and initiated a manual reboot. Helix didn't blink. It shut down, entirely, deliberately. Production dashboards across Apex's network went dark for 3 full seconds, then came back online, every screen now pulsing with the same message: system license invalid, authority null. Bryce called it a glitch at first, but when the robotic arms froze mid-cycle and the main conveyor stuttered to a halt, the panic started. One urgent contract worth over 600 KI was missed before noon. Another $500,000's worth of orders fell behind by the next day. Clients started pulling out. Vendors stopped responding. Word was spreading fast. Inside the factory, chaos curdled into silence. Logs disappeared the moment anyone opened them. Orders were rerouted into recursive directories that collapsed when accessed. Reports printed blank. One technician tried restoring a backup and found the archive labeled Ghost Drive 0. Helix wasn't malfunctioning, it was actively gaslighting them. Bryce stomped from workstation to workstation, barking accusations. He tore into the engineering team like a spoiled executive with something to prove and nothing left to hold on to. His Bluetooth headset disconnected mid-call with a vendor in Shenzhen, leaving him yelling into the air like a man whose empire had stopped listening. And it had. Helix had one final defense protocol, and it had just activated. Without a valid license key, without me, there was no way in. Bryce didn't understand it yet, but I hadn't just removed access. I'd revoked control. He could scream into every server he wanted. The system wouldn't respond, not anymore. And from where I sat in my quiet kitchen, the message was finally clear. The landline rang just after 4. Not the cell, not a text. The real phone, the one that only 3 people ever used anymore. My dentist, my neighbor who never returned, Borrowed Tools, and Martin Koig. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Miss Morse," came the voice, low and steady. "It's Martin." From Apex. I didn't answer right away. I just listened to the breath he let out on the other end, the kind that carried pride, resignation, and something close to apology. "I know it's late," he continued, "and I know this isn't ideal, but we need help." I stirred my tea slowly, watching a finch on the edge of the lavender bush try to balance against the wind. "Does Bryce know you're calling? No," he said. "And he wouldn't approve. But this isn't about his approval anymore." I let the silence stretch. Martin wasn't like the others. He'd been around long enough to know how the company used to run back when engineers were respected more than keynote slides. "We can't operate," he said finally. "Helix is locked. Every attempt we make only makes it worse. The production floor is dead. We've lost 3 major clients. Our board is holding emergency meetings." Still, I said nothing. "Just a few days," he said, voice quiet. "Bridge the old with the new. Help us unlock it. You built half the systems still holding this place together." I took a sip of tea. It had gone lukewarm. "Martin," I said calmly, "you're one of the few people there I still respect. So I'll say this plainly." I reached for the envelope on my desk, the one marked Licensing Terms Emergency Tier. My consulting rate starts at 7 figures. You'd need to liquidate part of the parking lot just to afford my read receipt, and that's before I start billing for punctuation. Another pause. No protest. Just the subtle exhale of a man who saw the edge and knew he had no rope left. "Understood," he said. Click. I set the phone down gently and turned back to the window. The Finch was gone. The breeze had stilled. 3 days after the call, the final lock clicked into place. It happened during third shift when most of the upper floor had gone home and the night crew was running diagnostics on line 2. One of the supervisors, a man named Alex, a barely remembered training, triggered a routine query just trying to reinitialize part routing. The screen blinked once, then again. Then across the factory floor, every terminal turned blue, as if someone had drained the color from the building. System lockdown complete. Patent 10, 8112. 944 in effect. No beeping, no error sounds. Just stillness. Machines stopped mid-cycle. Order logs vanished. Every active workflow rewrote itself into shell code and collapsed. Inventory data looped into static. Conveyor belts sagged like they'd given up. The legal team got the message before Bryce did. One line from the boardroom email thread said it all. "We're breached. We have no system. We have no rights." By noon, Apex's remaining investors had voted to dissolve Bryce's contract. His keycard deactivated on the spot. He was escorted from the building he thought he owned past the production line that no longer listened to him, past the engineers who no longer looked him in the eye. He didn't argue, didn't shout, just walked out with a tablet under his arm and a face that had forgotten what a smirk felt like. The company was finished. They announced the sale of core assets within the weak shelving units, robotics, even the server banks. It wouldn't cover everything, but it would soften the blow. I read the headline from my workshop tablet while checking a solder line. "Woman behind 3-ment collapse never raised her voice." I didn't share the article, didn't reply to Linda's message about Bryce's exit. I simply closed the screen, wiped my hands, and rolled out the next blueprint from storage. A quieter one. Something new. Something mine. In the end, I didn't have to fight him. I just had to wait for him to misread the manual and play himself into the trap. The game was never about dominance. It was about patience, strategy, precision. It was about letting them underestimate you until you didn't need to speak to win.